Snow needled Erling's face with 1,000 furious points. Each gust tore more warmth from his bones. His hands, once skilled with axe and spear, now shook uncontrollably, clutching his soaked cloak. He knew the signs: toes gone numb, treacherous sleepiness, whispering promises of rest, the temptation to simply lie down in the snow. His hunting party had left Bjorgvin 3 days prior, but the storm had descended from the mountains like Thor's own wrath, separating him from his companions in the dense forests. Now, lost among ancient pines whose branches groaned under snow, Erling stumbled on a hidden root and fell to his knees. The forest seemed alive and hostile. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, shadows danced between trunks like spirits of the dead, and the wind's howl sounded like distant screams. He thought of his father, Halvard, Jarl of Bjorgvin, who had sent him on this hunt to prove his worth. He thought of his promise to return with enough pelts to gift King Harald and secure their land's alliance. Now he would die here, honorless, frozen like a weak animal. His body would never be found, never given a proper funeral pyre. No skald would sing of Erling the Forgotten. Then he saw the light. First, he thought it a hallucination, the mind's cruel final trick. But no, through snow-laden branches shone a warm, constant amber glow. A house. Impossible, but real. Erling forced his numb legs to move, dragging himself through deep snow toward that promise of salvation. Each step was agony, each breath burned his lungs, but he pushed on. The light grew, clarified, and then a vision that defied all logic emerged before him. In the heart of the wild forest, where no human should live, stood a timber longhouse. Not a crude hut, but a well-maintained structure. Its walls of perfectly fitted logs, its roof turfed and steaming softly, melting the snow upon it. Golden light escaped through shuttered windows, and smoke rose from the central chimney, carrying the impossible scent of roasted meat and warm bread. Erling stopped before the door, his last strength fading, and knocked. Once, twice, thrice, before his legs finally gave way. The door opened before his body hit the frozen ground. Firm, surprisingly warm hands caught his shoulders, preventing his fall. Erling looked up and saw a woman. Not just any woman. She was disturbingly beautiful. With long hair the color of dark honey falling in waves over her shoulders, eyes deep green like forest moss, and pale skin that seemed to glow in the firelight from within. She wore a simple moss-green wool dress fastened with worked silver brooches, and her bare feet showed no discomfort from the cold emanating from the snow. She studied him for a moment that stretched into eternity, her eyes tracing his frozen face, soaked clothes, the spear he still clutched with near-dead fingers. "Come in," she said, her voice melodious but firm. "Unless you wish death to claim you on my threshold." It was no plea of compassion, but a factual statement. Erling tried to answer, to thank her, to ask who she was, but his words emerged as an incoherent groan. She slipped an arm under his shoulders with surprising strength for her delicate frame and helped him across the threshold. Heat struck Erling like a physical blow, making his nerves scream as sensation returned to frozen extremities. The interior defied all expectations of a forest dwelling. The central hall was spacious and impeccably clean, with a crackling stone hearth in the center, smoke rising through a roof vent. Fur rugs covered the polished wood floor, and the walls were decorated with aromatic bundles of drying herbs. A long oak table held ceramic bowls, clay jars, and, impossibly, fresh fruits that should not exist in the dead of winter. A wide bed with thick wool blankets occupied the opposite corner, and shelves laden with vials, scrolls, and curious objects lined the walls. This was a home built over years, not a hunter's temporary refuge. The woman guided Erling to a bench near the fire and began removing his frozen clothes with practical efficiency, without modesty or hesitation. "You arrived at the last possible moment," she commented, her fingers working swiftly at belts and clasps. "A few minutes more, and there would have been no saving you." Erling was too weak to protest. Too weak for shame. She wrapped him in a thick bearskin blanket that smelled of pine and herbs, then disappeared into a side chamber, returning with a steaming bowl of broth. "Drink slowly," she ordered. "Your stomach will rebel if you swallow too fast." He obeyed, taking small sips of the hot liquid that burned deliciously down his throat. It was a rich broth, seasoned with unrecognizable herbs, comforting in a way that went beyond the physical. He felt warmth spreading from his stomach through his body, life returning to his veins. The woman sat before him, watching with those penetrating green eyes that seemed to see beyond flesh and bone, straight into his soul. She asked his name and what a warrior of Bjorgvin was doing lost in her forests. "Erling," he croaked, "son of Halvard the Jarl, separated from my hunt by the storm." He asked who she was, how anyone lived alone in this wilderness. A small, enigmatic smile touched her lips. "Call me Liv. This forest has been my home longer than you can imagine. I know every tree, every stone, every secret path." She offered no further explanation, rising to prepare more food, leaving Erling alone with his questions and the fire's warmth. For the first time since the storm began, Erling noticed strange details. The house had no back door, only the front entrance. The windows, though they allowed light to escape, could not be opened. They were fixed, sealed with something like hardened resin. The herbs on the walls weren't just decorative. Many were used in the rituals of vulvas, priestesses who practiced Seder. And there were more. Discreet runic carvings etched into the doorframes, protective symbols he vaguely recognized. This was no simple hermit's hut. Liv was no simple woman. But as the broth warmed his stomach and exhaustion finally claimed its due, Erling decided those questions could wait. He was alive. That was all that mattered. Liv returned with dark bread and roasted venison, placing them before him. "You will need your strength," she said. "The storm will last at least 3 more days. You are trapped here with me until the winter's fury calms." Erling ate, feeling strength return to his muscles, heat fill his bones. And as he ate, he watched Liv move through the hall with a grace that bordered on supernatural, fluid, silent, as if her feet did not quite touch the floor. He tried not to think of the stories the elders told, of forest creatures who seduced lost men. He tried not to notice how she never fully turned her back to him, always maintaining an angle that hid her complete silhouette. He tried to ignore that. Despite the deadly cold outside, she remained barefoot without the slightest discomfort. Night fell, and with it, the storm intensified its fury. Winds howled like hungry wolves, snow beat against the house walls, but inside remained warm and safe. Liv prepared the bed for Erling, insisting he needed proper rest to recover from near freezing. She would sleep in her side chamber, she assured him. Erling did not argue. His limbs were heavy as stone, his eyes burned with exhaustion. He lay down on the soft blankets, his mind swimming in a fog of fatigue, and before sinking into sleep, he saw Liv standing by the hearth, her profile lit by dancing flames, staring into the fire as if reading prophecies in the embers. The first day passed in semi-conscious torpor. Erling woke at irregular intervals, drank broths Liv brought, ate pieces of honeyed bread, and plunged back into deep, dreamless sleep. The fever that accompanies near freezing consumed him, making him sweat under thick blankets as his body fought to restore itself. Liv tended to him with silent efficiency, changing cool compresses on his forehead, forcing him to drink bitter herbal infusions that calmed the chills. She spoke little during these ministrations, only murmuring in a tongue Erling half recognized but did not fully understand. Ancient words, perhaps, from times before. On the second morning, Erling awoke with a clear mind for the first time. The storm still raged outside, but inside the house reigned a strange peace. He propped himself on his elbows and observed the hall in the filtered light of the cloudy day. Liv was at the hearth, preparing something in an iron pot over the coals. Her hair fell loose down her back, reaching almost to her waist, and she hummed a soft melody as she worked. Erling coughed to announce he was awake. She turned with that small, enigmatic smile. "Feel strong enough to sit at the table?" He tested his legs, sore, weak, but functional, and rose carefully, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. She had prepared oatmeal with honey and nuts, accompanied by weak ale and fresh bread. As they ate, she asked about Bjorgvin, his family, the life of a Jarl's son. Erling answered, grateful for the distraction, telling of his father Halvard, a hard but just man who ruled the coastal lands with a firm hand. He spoke of his mother Astrid, dead giving birth to his younger sister 5 winters past, and how that loss had hardened his father further. When Erling asked about Liv's own life, she grew evasive. She said only that she came from far away, from lands to the north where forests were denser and older. She had chosen this place for its solitude, far from villages and their complications. She mentioned no family, husband, children, nothing indicating normal connections for a woman of her age. Erling estimated she might have seen 25 winters, though something in her eyes suggested a far greater age. He pressed delicately, asking if she did not fear living alone, so vulnerable to wild animals, bandits, or forest spirits. Liv laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed strangely in the hall. "The forest is my ally, not my enemy. The animals do not trouble me," she said, "and bandits rarely venture this deep into the mountains. As for spirits, well, they know I am no threat." She spoke of these things too casually, as if discussing known neighbors rather than supernatural forces. A chill ran down Erling's spine, but he attributed it to his own lingering weakness. The days dragged with peculiar slowness. The storm continued relentless, transforming the outside world into a white void of snow and wind. Erling regained strength gradually, helping Liv with simple tasks, feeding the fire, organizing firewood, mending tools. She accepted his help with grace, but he noticed she always took on tasks requiring her to go to the back of the house, to the side chamber she kept sealed. Once, when Erling offered to fetch something from that room, Liv refused with surprising firmness, saying that space was private, sacred even, not suited for male eyes. During the long nights, they talked by the fire. Liv revealed herself to be a surprising authority on ancient sagas, stories of the gods that even Bjorgvin's most experienced skalds did not know. She spoke of Yggdrasil's first days, when the realms were not completely separate and creatures of all kinds walked freely between worlds. She spoke of Freya with intimate familiarity, as if she knew the goddess personally, describing not only her love affairs, but her ferocity in battle, her mastery of satyr that frightened even Odin. Erling listened fascinated, forgetting to question how a simple hermit possessed such knowledge. During one of these conversations, Liv casually touched Erling's arm while making a point in her narrative. The touch was brief, just her fingers brushing his forearm, but Erling felt an electric shock run through his skin. He looked at her surprised, and for a moment their eyes met. His questioning, hers deep and ancient beyond any human measure. Liv withdrew her hand quickly and looked away, but something had changed in the air between them. Something had been acknowledged, even if neither put it into words. On the 5th night of his stay, Erling awoke in the dark with the sensation of being watched. The hearth had diminished to faint embers, casting a pulsing red light through the hall. He turned his head slowly and saw Liv standing by the window, looking out at the storm through the cracks. She did not realize he was awake. In the faint light, Erling swore he saw something. A shadow, a shape, moving behind her, connected to her back but separate, like a tail or an extension of her body. He blinked, and the vision disappeared. Only Liv standing there, solitary, beautiful, impossible. Erling closed his eyes quickly and pretended to sleep, but his heart raced. The stories returned to his mind, stories he had dismissed as drunken elders' superstitions. Huldra, the forest women. They appeared as beautiful maidens, lured men to their homes, and those men were never seen again. Or, in gentler versions, those men returned years later, changed, speaking of impossible loves in worlds beyond the mortal. Huldras were recognized by their tails, cowtails, or hollow backs, which they carefully hid from humans. They never turned their backs completely, always maintained angles that concealed their true forms, exactly as Liv did. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him running for the door, storm or not. But strangely, Erling felt only intense curiosity and, to his own surprise, excitement. If Liv was truly Huldra, she had saved his life. She had cared for him with genuine kindness. She had not tried to seduce or harm him. The stories might be wrong or incomplete. Perhaps Huldras were not the evil seductresses that southern Christian priests painted, but simply forest creatures living their own lives. In the morning, Erling mentioned nothing of what he had seen, or thought he had seen. Liv prepared breakfast as always, and they ate in comfortable companionship. But now Erling watched with renewed attention. He noticed how she never sat completely straight, always half leaning, how her clothes were cut to flow loosely down her back, how she moved with a dance-like grace, almost as if an invisible part of her body needed extra space to move. And he noticed, too, how she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying his face, his movements, with an expression of yearning mixed with sadness. On the 7th day, the storm finally began to abate. The winds still howled, but with less fury, and the snow fell more slowly. Liv commented that soon Erling could leave, return to Bjorgvin, to his life as a warrior and Jarl's son. She said this with a neutral voice, but Erling detected something beneath the surface. Reluctance, perhaps, or fear. He replied that yes, he would need to leave soon before his father sent search parties that could get lost the same way. But, as he spoke, he realized part of him did not want to leave. Part of him wanted to stay in this strange house with this mysterious woman, suspended in time away from responsibilities and expectations. It was Liv who broke the uncomfortable silence that followed. She asked if Erling had someone waiting for him in Bjorgvin, a wife, a betrothed, a lover. He shook his head. My father arranged a marriage with a neighboring Jarl's daughter, but the agreement is not yet final. The girl Sigrid is only 15 winters. I barely know her. It is a political union, not one of the heart. Liv nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she already suspected, then changed the subject abruptly, offering to teach him about the medicinal herbs that grew in those forests. They spent the afternoon organizing Liv's stock, she explaining the properties of each dried plant, which healed wounds, which caused sleep, which could kill if used incorrectly. Erling absorbed the knowledge avidly, impressed by the depth of her wisdom. It was the knowledge of a Volva, a priestess who had dedicated an entire life to the study of the ancient arts. He asked if she practiced Seder, the magic Odin had learned from Freya. Liv hesitated, then admitted that yes, to a certain extent. She had visions sometimes, dreams that proved prophetic. She could speak with forest spirits, negotiate with creatures others didn't even perceive existed. Erling found himself confessing things he had never told anyone, his doubts about following the warrior path his father insisted on, his secret desire to travel, to explore the distant realms merchants described. He spoke of the pressure of being the firstborn son, heir to lands and titles he wasn't sure he wanted. Liv listened without judgment, only nodding occasionally, and when he finished, she said something that surprised him. Destiny is not a prison, she said. Even the gods can choose paths different from those the Norns weave, though there is always a price to pay. That night, the last before Erling could truly depart, they sat by the fire longer than usual. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. At one point, Liv mentioned she had enjoyed having company, that winters were long and lonely. Erling replied that he had enjoyed being there, that he felt more at peace in that isolated house than he ever had in his father's bustling halls. Then, in a moment of impulsive courage, he asked directly, "Are you mortal? Human? Like me?" The silence that followed was heavy and charged. Liv looked at him for a long time, her green eyes reflecting the hearth's flames. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "There are many ways of being. Mortal and immortal are not always categories as separate as humans believe." She neither denied nor confirmed, leaving the truth suspended in the air between them. Erling nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer. "It doesn't matter what you are. You saved my life, and I am grateful. If you keep secrets, you have that right." Liv smiled, the first truly warm smile Erling had seen on her face, and said, "You are different from the other men who occasionally get lost in my forests. Most, when they begin to suspect the truth, flee terrified or try to kill me with cold iron, certain I am a demon or a witch." Erling asked what had happened to those men. "The terrified ones, I guide back to safety with cloudy memories of their days with me. As for the aggressive ones, well, the forest has ways of dealing with those who bring violence to its heart." The morning of the 8th day dawned clear and cold, the rising sun transforming the snow into a sea of diamonds. The storm had passed completely, leaving a silent, virgin world. Erling awoke knowing he must depart. There were no more excuses, no more justifiable delays. His father would be worried, possibly already organizing search expeditions, But when he rose and began to prepare, he found unexpected resistance in his own movements, as if part of him were physically anchored to this place. Liv prepared a hearty breakfast: wild goose eggs, smoked meat, fresh bread with butter she somehow had, and warm mead spiced with spices. They ate in heavy silence, both avoiding looking directly at each other. Finally, Erling formally thanked her for all she had done, offering payment in silver or a promise of supplies when he returned. Liv refused with a gentle wave of her hand. Hospitality is not a commercial transaction. It is a sacred duty, and I will accept no payment. Then she offered something unexpected. She knew a shortcut through the mountains that would take Erling back to Bjorgvin in half the time of the normal trails. But, she warned, the path passed through ancient places. Places where the barrier between realms was thin and creatures beyond the mortal sometimes walked. If he accepted her guidance, he would need to trust her instructions completely and not deviate from the path she would mark. Erling, eager to return and curiously reluctant to leave her, agreed immediately. Liv prepared for the journey with an efficiency that demonstrated a deep familiarity with the winter forest. She donned a heavy fur cloak, pulled on sturdy boots, the first time Erling had seen her wear footwear, and filled a leather bag with provisions. When they left the house, she locked the door carefully and made quick gestures over the frame, tracing invisible runes in the air that glowed briefly with a bluish light before disappearing. Protections, Erling presumed, against intruders during her absence. The forest under the sun was completely different from the forest under the storm. The trees rose majestic and beautiful, their snow-laden branches shining like crystals. Animals had left delicate tracks in the fresh snow: rabbits, foxes, deer. Birds sang in high branches, celebrating the sun's return. But even in the beauty of the clear day, there was a disquieting quality to the forest, a sensation of being watched by 1,000 invisible eyes, of walking through territory that tolerated human presence but did not welcome it. Liv moved through the deep snow with supernatural ease, her steps barely leaving marks while Erling sank to his knees with each step. She knew every hidden rock, every fallen log, every frozen stream, guiding them through a landscape that seemed untouched by human feet. She spoke occasionally, pointing out ancient trees that housed benevolent spirits, or areas that should be avoided where darker creatures made their homes. Erling listened with growing attention, realizing she spoke of these things not as legends but as observable facts. At midday, they stopped in a clearing where a massive rock emerged from the snow, its surface covered with runic carvings so old they were almost erased by erosion. Liv touched the stone reverently and explained that this was a place of power, where in ancient times, vulvas came to commune with spirits and receive visions. She said she could sometimes still feel echoes of those ancient ceremonies, see ghosts of women chanting songs in long-forgotten tongues. Erling asked if she came here for her own practices, and Liv admitted yes, especially during seasonal changes when the veils between worlds were thinnest. They continued walking, and Liv began to speak more openly about herself, not exactly revealing her true nature, but allowing Erling to glimpse truths through metaphors and half-confessions. She said she had been born of a mother who was not completely human, in a time when boundaries between species were more fluid. Her father was a mortal warrior who had ventured deep into the ancient forests and found more than he expected. The romance had been brief but intense, ending when he returned to his human life, unable to abandon his world completely despite the love he felt. Liv had grown up between two worlds, not fully accepted in either. Among mortals, she was too strange, too different, too frightening. Among forest creatures, she was tainted by human blood, too weak to be truly one of them. So, she had chosen solitude, building her house in that isolated place where she could simply be herself without needing to hide or explain her nature. She lived a long time, longer than common mortals, though she was not truly immortal. She aged slowly, healed quickly from injuries, possessed sharpened senses, and a connection with the forest that went beyond the natural. Erling listened, hypnotized, beginning finally to understand the magnitude of what Liv was. He asked if she felt lonely, living so apart. Liv stopped walking and turned to face him, the first time she had done so completely, directly. "Loneliness is the price I pay for freedom," she said. "But yes, sometimes I wish for company that lasted more than passing seasons." The way she said it, looking directly into his eyes, made Erling's heart race. They walked in silence for a time, the tension between them growing with each step. The sun began to descend, casting long shadows through the pines. Liv commented they would need to camp before full dark, that the final leg to Bjorgvin could be completed in the morning. They found a sheltered area under an overhanging cliff where snow had not accumulated as deeply. Liv lit a fire with surprising ease. She simply touched the dry wood and flames sprouted without need for flint or tinder. As they ate the provisions Liv had brought, Erling gathered courage to ask something that had been bothering him since he began to suspect the truth. He asked if she had truly saved his life that stormy night, or if she had somehow called the storm, manipulated events to bring him to her door. The question could have been offensive, accusatory, but he asked it with genuine curiosity, without judgment. Liv considered at length before answering. She admitted she had not created the storm. That was beyond her powers, the work of the gods themselves. But she confessed she had felt his presence in the forest, tracked him through the connection she had with all living things within her territory. When she realized he was dying, she had a choice: to let nature take its course, or to intervene. She chose to intervene not out of obligation, but because something in him called to her, a resonance she had not felt in a long time. Erling asked what that resonance was, what she had felt. Liv hesitated, her eyes shining in the firelight, then answered with brutal honesty. "You carry the mark of someone between worlds," she said. "Just as I do. Not in your blood, but in your spirit. Part of you yearns for something beyond the mortal world, beyond the rigid rules and structures of human society. I recognize that because I feel the same, and in that moment of decision on my threshold, I chose to save someone who might understand me." The confession hung heavy in the cold night air. Erling felt his pulse quicken, his mind spinning with the implications. Part of him wanted to deny it, insist he was just a common warrior, a Jarl's son, with nothing special or supernatural about him. But another part, a deeper, more honest part, recognized the truth in Liv's words. He had always felt displaced, as if wearing skin that didn't fit perfectly, as if there were a different life waiting beyond the horizon he would never reach. Then Erling did something impulsive and potentially dangerous. He reached across the dancing flames and took Liv's hand. He felt the shock of that contact again, stronger this time, like a current of energy flowing between them. He said it didn't matter what she was, where she came from, or what secrets she kept. She had shown more kindness and understanding in a few days than most people did in a lifetime. If she was Huldra, a forest creature, a being between worlds, then he considered it a privilege to have met one. Tears shone in Liv's eyes, the first display of raw emotion she had allowed. She said he didn't fully understand what he was offering, that there were reasons her kind lived apart from mortals. Humans who became involved with Huldras often became trapped, unable to fully return to mortal life. Haunted by memories and yearnings that could never be satisfied. Some went mad. Others abandoned families, duties, honor, just to seek again that brief glimpse of a world beyond. Erling replied that perhaps that was a risk worth taking, that a life of empty honor and meaningless battles seemed no better than a life haunted by memories of something real. Liv laughed then, a genuine laugh mixed with sobs, and said he was a fool, a wonderfully foolish mortal. But she didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with his, and they stayed like that, connected across the flames as stars emerged in the clear sky above. That night, under the cold northern stars, Liv told Erling stories she had never shared with a mortal. Stories of her childhood among the ancestral trees, of learning the forest's secret language from her mother, of watching generations of humans come and go while she remained, constant as the seasons. She spoke of brief loves she had had over the decades, mortals who stumbled into her path and touched her for a moment before moving on with their own lives. And she spoke of the loneliness that weighed heavier each year, the growing desire for a connection that lasted, for someone who could see her completely without fleeing in terror. Erling shared his own stories, memories of growing up under the weight of his father's expectations, of training with a sword since he was old enough to hold one, of watching his father grow more bitter and distant after his mother's death. He spoke of feeling like he was living someone else's life, playing a role written by forces beyond his control. He confessed that part of him hoped to die honorably in battle, not out of desire for glory, but simply because death in combat was honorable, acceptable, while admitting he didn't want that life was unthinkable. When sleep finally came, they kept their hands intertwined even in the cold of the night, the fire burning low between them. It was a strange intimacy, not physical in the carnal sense, but deep in ways Erling had never experienced. He felt he knew Liv better after those hours of conversation than he knew people he had lived with his entire life. And he suspected she felt the same. In the morning, they awoke to a thick fog covering the forest, the world reduced to a small circle of visibility around their camp. Liv commented that the fog was a sign. The boundary between worlds was especially thin that day, and they would need to be careful on the final leg of the journey. She instructed Erling to stay close, no matter what he saw or heard. The forest would try to confuse him, lure him onto wrong paths, especially now that he had touched the supernatural more deeply through his connection with her. They walked through the fog with Liv guiding, and Erling began to perceive shapes moving in the mist. Shadows that never fully solidified, whispers in languages he almost understood. Now and then, he saw faces emerging from the trees, beautiful and terrible, watching them with curiosity or hostility. Liv conversed with some of them in a fluid, melodious tongue, negotiating passage, asking permission, offering small offerings, breadcrumbs, drops of mead spilled into the snow. It was during the crossing of a particularly dense valley that Erling finally saw. Liv was ahead, navigating a narrow trail between ancient trees, and for a moment the fog parted, filtered sunlight illuminating her from the side. And there, connected to her back and flowing behind her like a natural extension of her body, was a tail, long, covered with fine hair the color of her locks, ending in a tuft similar to a cow's but more graceful, more ethereal. It moved independently, swaying gently as she walked, responding to the terrain and balance in a way no natural tail would. Erling froze for a moment, all the confirmations of his suspicions solidifying into undeniable vision. Liv realized he had stopped and turned, following his gaze, and saw exactly what he had seen. The expression on her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, despair, and finally resignation. The fog closed again, hiding her tail, but the damage was done. The truth was completely, undeniably revealed. The silence that followed the revelation was as dense as the fog surrounding them. Liv remained motionless, watching Erling with an expression that blended defiance and vulnerability, as if expecting him to scream, flee, or worse, draw his spear and try to kill her as so many other men had upon discovering her true nature. Her hands were tense at her sides, prepared to defend herself or use magic if necessary. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, all the misty forms and whispers ceasing, awaiting the mortal's reaction. But Erling did not flee. He did not scream. He did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to touch Liv. "I already suspected," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This only confirms what my heart already knew." He asked if the tail hurt, if there was any discomfort in constantly hiding it. The mundane, practical, surprisingly normal question made Liv laugh, a broken laugh, half hysterical with relief and disbelief. "It doesn't hurt physically," she replied, "but the emotional weight of hiding is a constant exhaustion." She explained that among humans, revealing her true form meant death or persecution. Southern Christians would call her a demon. Old Norse would see her as a threat to their homes, their families. Even those who initially accepted eventually turned against her, frightened by what they didn't understand. So she had learned long ago to remain hidden, to interact with mortals only superficially, to never let anyone get close enough to see through the disguise. Erling said he wasn't afraid of her, that if her intention were to harm him, she had had countless opportunities. He asked if he could, and he hesitated, as if the question itself were a transgression. See completely, without veils or concealments. Liv studied his face for a long moment, searching for signs of dishonesty or disguised horror. Then, slowly, she nodded and let her defenses fall completely. The transformation was not dramatic or frightening. The tail, already partially visible through the fog, simply solidified completely, becoming fully material and real. It was beautiful in its strangeness, covered with silky fur that captured the light even in the mist, moving with a life of its own, expressing emotions her trained face did not show. At that moment, it swayed nervously, revealing the anxiety Liv felt. Her human form remained unchanged, but now Erling could see a subtle glow to her skin, an ethereal quality in her eyes, a presence that was clearly more than mortal. Erling reached out slowly, giving Liv time to retreat if she wished, and gently touched the tail. It was warm, soft, and he felt muscles moving under his fingers as it reacted to his touch. Liv gasped, not in pain, but in surprise. She explained it was an extremely sensitive part of her being, that no one but her mother had touched it since her childhood. Erling's touch was the first true intimacy she had allowed in decades. They remained like that for a moment that seemed suspended outside time, Erling marveling at the reality of what had once been only legends, Liv trembling with the vulnerability of being completely exposed. It was Liv who finally broke the silence, saying they needed to continue, that the fog wouldn't last forever, and when it cleared, they would be vulnerable to eyes that shouldn't see. She recomposed her disguised form, hiding the tail again, and resumed their march through the misty forest. But something had fundamentally changed between them. The trust Liv had placed in Erling by revealing herself completely had created a bond beyond the rationale. He followed her now with a deep understanding that she had risked everything, her safety, possibly her life, by trusting him. And that weight, that responsibility, settled on his shoulders like an invisible mantle. As they walked, Liv began to explain more about her kind. Huldras were guardians of the ancient forests, born from unions between earth spirits and mortals, in times when such unions were more common. They were not immortal like the gods, but lived several centuries, aging slowly. They possessed nature-related magic. They could speak with animals, influence plant growth, sense disturbances in their territories. But they were also vulnerable. Cold iron could wound them permanently, and revealing their true forms to hostile humans often resulted in hunts that lasted generations. Erling absorbed every word, fascinated and saddened. He asked how many of her kind still existed. Liv replied she didn't know for certain. Huldras were solitary by nature, rarely meeting, each guarding their own territory. She suspected there might be a dozen in the northern forests, perhaps fewer. Human expansion, the cutting of ancient forests, the rise of the new Christian religion that demonized everything it didn't understand, all were pushing her kind towards slow extinction. The fog began to dissipate as they descended from the higher mountains. The trees became less dense, and through the branches, Erling began to recognize familiar landmarks. They were near Bjorgvin, perhaps only an hour's walk from the outer limits of his father's lands. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This impossible journey was ending, and with it, his connection with Liv would also end. She would return to her solitary house in the mountains, and he would return to the life of a Jarl's son, a warrior. A man destined for an arranged marriage and meaningless battles. Liv stopped in a clearing where the sun finally penetrated completely, melting the snow in patches and revealing dead grass beneath. She said this was the point where they should part. She pointed through the trees where distant smoke marked Bjorgvin's location. Erling could easily find his way from there, and she should not approach closer to the human settlement. She had already risked too much by coming this far. Erling protested, saying he wanted to see her again, that he couldn't simply let her disappear from his life. Liv shook her head sadly, explaining there was no future for them. He was mortal, she was not. He had responsibilities, family, duties. She had only solitude and the forest. What they had shared was a precious gift, a moment outside time, but a moment that could not extend into lasting reality. It would be better for both if he continued his life, eventually forgetting those strange days in the mountains. But even as she spoke, tears streamed down her face, betraying her words. Erling saw the truth. She didn't want to let him go any more than he wanted to leave. Some connection had formed between them, something that transcended the barriers of species and destiny. He took Liv's face between his hands, forcing her to look into his eyes, and swore he would return. He didn't know how or when, but he would find a way back to her. It was at that moment they heard sounds, male voices, barking dogs, the noise of men moving through the forest. A search party. Erling's father had indeed sent men to look for him. Liv pushed Erling away, urgently whispering that he needed to go now before they saw him with her. If they discovered a Huldra so close to Björgvin, they would organize a hunt. They would use iron and fire, not resting until she was killed or driven so far she no longer posed a threat. Erling hesitated, torn between duty and desire, between the mortal world that reclaimed him and the magical world he had touched so briefly. The sounds grew closer. He recognized the voice of Bjorn, captain of his father's guard, calling his name. Liv pushed him again, more firmly, then did something unexpected. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a brief, desperate kiss, charged with everything they couldn't say. Then she pulled away and ran into the forest, moving with supernatural speed, disappearing among the trees as if she had never existed. Erling stood stunned, his fingers touching his lips where he still felt the warmth of her touch. The sounds of the search party grew louder, closer. He forced himself to move, to walk toward the voices, to leave behind the clearing where his heart had been irrevocably altered. Bjorn emerged from the trees with half a dozen men and 2 tracking dogs. His expression of concern transformed into relief when he saw Erling. He rushed forward, grabbing the young man's shoulders, examining him for injuries. He asked where he had been, how he had survived the storm, if he was wounded. Erling, his mind still reeling, improvised a story about finding a cave in the mountains, waiting out the storm, getting lost, trying to find his way back. It was a weak story, full of holes, but Bjorn was too relieved to question deeply. As the group returned to Björgvin, Erling looked back repeatedly, searching for a glimpse of Liv among the trees. He never saw her, but once, just once, he thought he saw movement in the distant shadows, a graceful shape watching him leave, saying goodbye silently. He touched his lips again, the memory of the kiss still burning, and made a silent vow. I will return. But destiny, as Liv had warned, had plans of its own. Björgvin received Erling with cautious celebration. His father, Halvard, alternated between relief and anger, embracing his son, then reprimanding him for his recklessness. Erling's story about surviving in a cave was accepted, though some elders murmured about impossible luck, about how no one should have survived that particular storm. But life quickly resumed its normal rhythm. Training, council meetings, preparations for the arranged marriage his father insisted on finalizing. 3 days after his return, Erling realized something was deeply wrong. He awoke in the middle of the night feeling suffocated, as if the walls of his chamber were closing in. The air inside the longhouse seemed stale, stifling, when it had never bothered him before. The sounds of the village, conversations, laughter, daily work, that had once been comforting now seemed an irritating cacophony. And at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, he felt a physical pull toward the mountains, as if an invisible rope were tugging him back to that isolated house, to that woman who was not completely a woman. Liv had warned about this. Mortals who touched the supernatural world became marked, changed in ways that could not be undone. Erling tried to resist, force himself to focus on his duties, but it was like trying to hold water between his fingers. His mind constantly wandered during training. Conversations with other young warriors seemed empty, meaningless. Even a visit from Sigrid, his betrothed, left him completely indifferent. She was pretty, polite, everything a Jarl's wife should be, and he felt absolutely nothing. His father noticed the change. In a private meeting, Halvard confronted Erling, asking what had truly happened in the mountains. Erling maintained his story, but Halvard was no fool. He commented that something had altered his son, that he had returned with the eyes of someone who had seen beyond the mortal veil. He asked if Erling had encountered a vulva in the mountains, if she had cast some spell on him. The question was closer to the truth than Halvard could imagine, but Erling denied it. He said the near-death experience had changed his perspective. Nothing more. Halvard seemed not to believe completely, but pressed no further. Instead, he announced that the marriage with Sigrid would be accelerated. It would take place within a new moon. Perhaps a wife and family responsibilities would bring Erling back to reality. That announcement was the final blow. Erling realized he was being trapped, bound to a life he didn't want through chains of duty and honor he couldn't break without completely dishonoring his family. That night, he lay in his bed and for the first time since childhood, cried. He cried for the connection he had found and lost. He cried for the golden prison that was his privileged life. He cried for Liv, alone in her house in the mountains, probably expecting him never to return like all the others before him. It was Astrid, his 10-winter-old younger sister, who found him crying. She entered silently and sat beside his bed, her small hand touching his arm. She asked what was wrong, why her strong brother cried like a child. And perhaps because she was just a child, perhaps because he desperately needed to tell someone. Erling told her. Not all the details, but enough. He spoke of the woman in the forest who had saved him, of the connection he felt, of how he couldn't forget her but also couldn't have her. Astrid listened with seriousness beyond her years, then said something surprisingly wise. The Skalds always sing of heroes who defied destiny, she said, who chose their own paths even when gods and men said it was impossible. Some failed and became cautionary tales, but some triumphed and became legends. She asked which story Erling preferred to be. The child's words echoed in Erling's mind in the following days. He watched the wedding preparations with growing detachment, as if observing another person's life. During a council meeting where his father discussed alliances and military strategies, Erling found himself thinking of how Liv had spoken of destiny, how even gods could choose different paths, though there was always a price to pay. It was during a blot ceremony, a ritual sacrifice to the gods before important undertakings, that Erling finally understood what he needed to do. The Volva conducting the ceremony fell into a deep prophetic trance, and her words, though directed at the whole group, seemed to strike Erling specifically. She spoke of choices between honor that imprisons and freedom that terrifies, of loves that transcend worlds, of sacrifices necessary for a true life. When she came out of the trance, she looked directly at Erling with a recognition that made his blood run cold. After the ceremony, the Volva approached him privately. She said she saw a mark upon him, the mark of a forest creature, of a Huldra. It was no curse, she clarified, but a bond. Something rare, precious, and dangerously fragile. She warned that such bonds could not be ignored without terrible consequences. Men who tried to suppress them eventually went mad or wasted away, consumed by a yearning that could not be satisfied. The only solution was to accept the bond or break it completely, and breaking it would require the death of one of the bonded. Erling asked if there was a third option, some way to maintain the bond while still living his mortal life. The Volva shook her head slowly. Perhaps, she said, if he was willing to pay a high enough price. He would have to abandon position, inheritance, everything he knew. He would be seen as mad or cursed. His family would disown him. His name would be forgotten or stained. But if he was willing to accept that, then yes, he could have both, mortal life and supernatural love, though never completely, never without complications. That night, Erling made the decision that would change everything. The new moon approached rapidly, bringing with it the day of the arranged marriage Erling now saw as a death sentence. Bjorgvin buzzed with preparations. The neighboring Jarl would arrive with Sigrid and her retinue. There would be elaborate feasts, alliances would be cemented. Erling himself was almost irrelevant in those preparations, just a necessary piece in his father's political game. That perception, far from offending him, brought cold clarity. Erling began making his own preparations in secret. He gathered supplies, dried food, pelts, tools, hiding them in a small storage shed near the village limits. He studied maps and memorized the path Liv had shown through the mountains. He waited patiently, playing the role of the obedient son while planning an escape that would shock everyone who knew him. 3 nights before the wedding, something happened that accelerated his plans. A group of hunters returned from an expedition with a disturbing story. They had found strange tracks in the mountains, footprints that began human but gradually transformed into something else. Not completely animal, but not completely human either. One of the men, too drunk for caution, proclaimed loudly that they were signs of a Huldra, that a cursed creature was living too close to their lands and should be hunted and killed. The suggestion might have been dismissed as superstition if not for Knut, an older warrior and fervent convert to Christianity during travels south. He supported the idea with alarming zeal, citing priests who said such creatures were demons, abominations that seduced honest men to perdition. He argued that Bjorgvin could not prosper with such a threat lurking in the forests. They needed to organize a hunt, cleanse their lands of evil influence. Erling felt his blood run cold as he listened to the discussion unfold in the mead hall. His father, Halvard, initially hesitant, was being swayed by Canute's arguments and others. Not by religious zeal, Halvard still honored the old gods, but by political pragmatism. A show of strength against a supernatural threat would impress allies, especially those already embracing the new religion. And if such a creature truly existed, better to eliminate it before it caused problems. When Halvard finally agreed to organize a hunting expedition after the wedding, Erling knew he could wait no longer. He needed to warn Liv, and he needed to do it immediately. That night, while the village slept after prenuptial festivities, Erling collected his hidden supplies. Donned warm clothes, took only a spear and knife, weapons enough for defense against wild animals, but nothing suggesting hostile intent, and disappeared silently into the night. The journey through the mountains at night was dangerous and foolish, but Erling had no choice. He used the crescent moon and stars for navigation, following his memory of the path Liv had shown. Several times he got lost, had to backtrack, find recognizable landmarks. The cold bit through his clothes, and the forest's night sounds, distant wolf howls, owl screeches, unexplained creaks, kept him constantly alert. It was nearly dawn when he finally spotted Liv's house. It looked different in the gray pre-dawn light, less welcoming, more mysterious. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light shone in the windows. For a terrible moment, Erling feared she had left, abandoned that place. Then the door opened slowly and Liv emerged, wrapped in a fur cloak, her hair disheveled from sleep, her eyes wide with shock at seeing him. Erling spoke quickly, breathless from the walk and urgency. He explained about the hunters, the discovered tracks, the planned expedition. Liv grew pale, her hands clutching the edge of her cloak. She said she had been careless, too distracted by thoughts of him to mask her tracks properly. That was her fault, and now she would pay the price. She began to speak of how she would need to flee, move deeper into the mountains where humans rarely ventured, abandon the house she had built over decades. Erling interrupted, taking her hands. He said there was another option. She could come with him. Not back to Bjorgvin, that would be suicide, but away, to lands where no one knew them. He had heard stories of settlements on distant islands, of villages on remote coasts where people asked few questions about others' pasts. They could start a new life there. Together. Liv looked at him as if he had gone mad. She asked what he was proposing, if he understood what he was offering to abandon. He was a Jarl's heir. Had wealth, position, a bright future ahead. All she could offer was a life of fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, always fearing discovery. And she was not mortal. He would age and die while she remained young. Eventually, she would have to watch him wither, and that pain would be unbearable. Erling replied that he knew all that, had thought about every obstacle, every necessary sacrifice, and he still chose it. He chose a real life, even if short, over a long life living a lie. He chose an impossible, complicated love over a convenient, empty marriage. He said she had changed something fundamental in him, shown him there was more in the world than empty honor and rigid traditions. He could not return to that previous blindness. Liv began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face as she wrestled with an impossible decision. Part of her desperately wanted to accept, to seize this chance at happiness she never thought she could have. But another part, wiser and marked by centuries of pain, knew that condemning Erling to that path was cruel selfishness. He was young, barely more than 20 winters, didn't fully understand what he was offering to give up. Erling saw the hesitation in her eyes and played his final argument. He said if she sent him away, he would return to Bjorgvin, marry Sigrid, live the life his father had planned. But he would be just an empty shell of a man, going through the motions without ever truly being present. And when the hunting expedition was organized, he would be forced to join it. It was his duty as a Jarl's son, as a warrior. He would have to track Liv, possibly help kill her, or reveal himself a traitor by refusing. Both options were impossible. The brutal logic of that argument struck Liv like a physical blow. She realized there was no safe way back, that events had already been set in motion beyond any control. Either they fled together, or the bond between them would be broken in the most violent way possible. The Norns had woven their destinies together, and trying to unravel that weave now would only result in tragedy. Finally, Liv nodded. They would need to leave immediately before Bjorgvin's trackers began their expedition in earnest. They had perhaps 2-3 days before the hunt began in earnest. That time needed to be used to put maximum distance between them and Bjorgvin. She asked if Erling had an idea where to flee, which direction would be safest. Erling mentioned stories he had heard of lands beyond the mountains to the east, where dense, unexplored forests housed isolated communities living in the old way. Places where the old gods were still honored without Christian influence, where the supernatural was accepted as a natural part of the world. If they could reach those lands, perhaps they would find genuine refuge. Liv agreed that direction offered the best chance. She immediately began packing supplies. Not much, just the essentials they could carry on a difficult journey. She gathered vials of medicinal herbs, flint tools, seeds they might eventually plant. She took a small bark book where she had recorded knowledge accumulated over decades, wrapping it carefully in waterproof hides. And in a moment of uncharacteristic sentimentality, she took a small silver brooch that had belonged to her mother, the only physical memento of the woman who had given her life. While Liv prepared, Erling watched the house she was abandoning. Every object there had a story, meaning accumulated through lonely years. He asked if it was hard to leave everything behind. Objects can be replaced, Liv replied. Houses can be rebuilt. But a connection like what we share, that happens once in centuries, perhaps only once in an entire lifetime, no house is worth the price of losing that. They left as the sun was just beginning to appear over the eastern mountains. Liv cast final protection spells over her house, not to keep it safe but to obscure it, to make hunters pass without noticing, to look directly at it without truly seeing it. Then she turned and walked into the forest without looking back, Erling at her side. The initial journey was silent and determined. Liv guided them through trails only she knew, paths no normal human would discover. They moved quickly. Knowing every hour of distance gained now could mean the difference between freedom and capture later. Liv did not hide her true form as they walked. Her tail swayed freely, helping with balance on difficult terrain, and Erling found her even more beautiful in her revealed totality. On the second day of flight, they encountered their first serious obstacle. They came to a wide river, now swollen with early spring thaw, the waters fast and icy. There was no bridge, no obvious crossing place. Liv studied the waters with a worried expression, then turned to Erling and explained she could summon help. River creatures owed her favors from ancient packs, but doing so would leave a magical mark that skilled trackers could follow. It was a risk. But the alternative was a detour of days trying to find a safe crossing. Erling said he trusted her judgment to use whatever method she considered best. Liv nodded and approached the riverbank. She knelt and placed her hands in the water, beginning to chant in an ancient, melodious tongue. The words sent shivers down Erling's spine, charged with power he could feel but not understand. The water began to glow faintly with a greenish light, and then shapes began to emerge. Serpentine creatures, neither completely fish nor completely something else, with intelligent eyes and iridescent scales. Liv conversed with the creatures in her strange tongue, negotiating, explaining, asking. The creatures studied Erling with obvious curiosity. A mortal human traveling with a Huldra was an unusual sight. Finally, they seemed to agree. Two of the largest creatures positioned themselves parallel to the river, creating a kind of living bridge. Their broad, scaly backs barely emerged above the surface, but offered a path across the dangerous waters. Liv and Erling crossed carefully, balancing on the creatures that remained perfectly still, until they reached the opposite bank. Once safe, Liv thanked them formally and offered payment, a lock of her own hair, cut with a sharp knife and given to the waters. The creatures accepted the gift and dove, disappearing into the depths. Erling asked about the gift's meaning. Liv explained that hair, nails, blood, physical parts of magical beings had value among supernatural creatures. They could be used in spells, potions, rituals. Offering such parts of herself was a genuine sacrifice, appropriate payment for a great favor. Those creatures would probably use her hair to weave protections or charms for their own underwater nests. They continued east, climbing through increasingly high and desolate mountains. On the third day, snow began to fall again, not a furious storm like the one that had nearly killed Erling, but a constant, heavy fall that obscured their tracks. Liv commented it was unexpected luck. A gift from the gods, perhaps. Snow would cover their tracks, make tracking much more difficult. But snow also brought its own dangers. Temperatures dropped drastically, and even with warm clothes and Liv's ability to find sheltered spots, the cold was a constant challenge. One night, camped under a rocky overhang, Erling began to shiver uncontrollably, despite the furs and small fire they had lit. Liv realized he was dangerously close to hypothermia again. Without hesitation, Liv opened her own clothes and pulled Erling against her, wrapping them in all available blankets. Her body was surprisingly warm, a heat that came from within, not just normal body temperature. She explained that Huldras were creatures of the living forest, and as long as the forest lived, they retained vital heat from the earth itself. She shared that heat with Erling, holding him firmly as the shivers gradually subsided. It was that night, pressed together by survival necessity, that the final barriers between them dissolved. They spoke in whispers about possible futures, about what life would be like when they finally found safe refuge. Liv confessed she had never imagined she could have a true companion, always assuming she would live and die in solitude. Erling admitted that before meeting her, he had accepted a life without real passion, without genuine connection, seeing it as the inevitable destiny of a man of his position. When they finally slept, still entwined for warmth, both felt a peace they had not known before, a sensation of being exactly where they should be, with exactly who they should be, despite all logic and reason saying otherwise. The fourth morning dawned with a surprisingly clear sky. The snow had ceased during the night, leaving the world transformed into a landscape of crystalline beauty. But that beauty brought danger. Tracks in the fresh snow would be easy to follow if hunters caught up. Liv and Erling needed to move faster, farther. They descended the eastern side of the mountains into a deep valley where the forest was different from those to the west. The trees here were older, larger, their trunks so wide 5 men couldn't encircle them. Thick moss-covered stones and fallen logs, and the air had a cathedral quality. Silent, reverent, ancient. Liv breathed deeply and commented she could feel the presence of ancient spirits here, more powerful and numerous than in her own forests. In the heart of that ancient valley, they found something unexpected, a small settlement. Not an organized village like Bjorgvin, but a dispersed collection of houses built with obvious respect for the surrounding forest, incorporated among the trees rather than clearing them to make space. Smoke rose from several hearths, and they could hear distant sounds of human life, children playing, a smith working metal, voices conversing. Liv hesitated at the forest's edge, uncertain. Entering the settlement was a risk. Humans could be hostile, especially if they perceived what she was. But they were also dangerously low on supplies, and winter still bit hard enough to threaten prolonged survival in the wilderness. They needed to assess this place, discover if it could offer refuge or represented just another threat. Erling offered to enter first, alone, to discover the inhabitants' disposition. Liv agreed reluctantly, hiding in the forest as he advanced cautiously toward the settlement. He was met by a group of men and women working at various tasks, their expressions cautious but not immediately hostile. The group's leader, an elderly man with a long beard braided in the old style, approached and asked who Erling was and what he sought. Erling chose careful honesty. He explained he was traveling with a companion, that they had fled from lands to the west seeking a place where they could live without persecution. He didn't elaborate on the reasons for their flight, but something in his expression must have communicated genuine urgency. The elder studied him for a long moment, eyes penetrating as if he could read unspoken truths, then asked a surprising question. He asked if Erling's companion was like them, if she carried blood from beyond the purely mortal. The question revealed a fundamental truth about this place. These were not common humans living in simple isolation. They were a community that embraced and protected those between worlds, half-elves, descendants of unions with forest spirits, children of vulvas who had delved too deep into ancient magic. And Huldras, apparently, would also be welcome. Erling confirmed that yes, his companion was a Huldra and they needed safe refuge. The elder nodded slowly and said Erling should bring her, that the community would assess if they could offer a home. He warned they had strict rules. Protection of the collective came first. Anyone who brought danger would be expelled immediately, and all contributed equally to the group's survival. Liv emerged from the forest when Erling signaled, moving with obvious caution. She didn't try to hide her tail. Among these people, concealment seemed unnecessary and possibly offensive. The settlement's inhabitants watched her with curiosity, but without horror or hostility. Several people had their own peculiarities: a woman with eyes that glowed faintly like a cat's, a young man with overly long fingers strangely jointed, a child whose hair seemed to move independently like underwater seaweed. The settlement's matriarch, a vulva named Ragna, approached to assess Liv personally. She was a middle-aged woman with a presence that commanded immediate respect, runic scars carved into her forearms, and white eyes of someone who had sacrificed physical sight for deeper vision. She touched Liv's face with surprisingly gentle fingers, seeing through supernatural means, reading history and intentions. After a long silence, Ragna pronounced judgment. She said Liv carried genuine goodness in her essence, rare among her kind who often grew bitter from centuries of loneliness. As for Erling, she saw the sacrifice he had made, the love he had chosen over conventional honor. Both would be welcome to stay, at least temporarily, while they proved their value to the community. They were given a small cabin on the settlement's edge, a simple but solid structure with a functional hearth and basic bed. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely more than they had expected to find. For the first time since leaving Liv's house in the mountains, they could breathe without constantly looking over their shoulders. The following weeks established a new rhythm. Erling worked with the community's men, hunting, cutting firewood, building and repairing structures. His warrior training made him valuable for defense, and his natural leadership skills quickly earned respect. Liv worked with the women and other magic practitioners, sharing her extensive knowledge of herbs and healing in exchange for learning techniques the community had developed over generations. But peace had a price: constant vigilance. The settlement kept guards posted on approach trails, and alarm signals had been established in case quick evacuation was necessary. Everyone there knew the precariousness of their existence. One discovery by a hostile village, one lost hunter telling stories, and they could face an attack that would destroy everything they had built. 2 months after their arrival, the inevitable happened. A guard came running back to the settlement with alarming news. A group of armed men had been sighted approaching from the west, following old trails through the mountains. They weren't common travelers, but determined hunters, well-equipped and moving with specific purpose. Erling felt his stomach sink. He knew, without a shadow of doubt, that these were men from Bjorgvin. His father hadn't given up the hunt, both for the Huldra and, probably, for the traitor son who had disappeared the same night. The expedition had taken months to organize and track through treacherous mountains, but now it was dangerously close. The community gathered for an urgent council. Some argued for immediate evacuation, abandoning the settlement and fleeing further east. Others wanted to stay and defend, prepare ambushes, use magic to confuse and repel the invaders. Erling remained silent during the debate, knowing he and Liv were the cause of this danger. Finally, he stood and offered a solution no one else had suggested. He proposed meeting the hunters alone, far from the settlement, and resolving this one way or another. If he could convince his father to give up the hunt, to accept that he had chosen a different path, perhaps violence could be avoided. If not, at least it would be a confrontation between him and those hunting him, without involving innocent people from the community. Liv protested violently, saying that was insanity, that they would kill him or drag him back in chains. But Erling remained firm. He explained he had lived his entire life as a Jarl's son, knew those men, knew their mentality. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to appeal to their honor, to make them understand. Ragna, the vulva, intervened with a third option. She offered to accompany Erling, serving as mediator and witness. Her presence would signal that Erling wasn't alone, that forces beyond the purely physical protected this place. And if negotiation failed, she could use magic to ensure Erling and Liv escaped, though that would cost much of her own life force. After intense debate, the plan was accepted. Erling and Ragna would leave in the morning to intercept the hunters before they came too close to the settlement. Liv would be kept safe within the community, ready to flee if everything went wrong. She agreed only when Erling made her swear she would survive, that she wouldn't sacrifice her life for the symbolic value of trying to save him if there was failure. That final night before the confrontation, Liv and Erling stayed awake late, holding each other, whispering words that might be their last. Liv confessed those months had been the happiest of her long life, that if everything ended tomorrow, it would be worth every moment. Erling replied that she had given him something he never knew was missing: true purpose, genuine connection, a reason to live beyond just fulfilling others' expectations. In the morning, Erling donned simple armor the community had provided, not the fine pieces he would wear as a Jarl's son, but practical reinforced leather protection. He carried a spear and sword, not to attack, but to demonstrate he wasn't a helpless supplicant. Ragna prepared as well, wearing her ceremonial clothes marked with runes of power, carrying a staff carved with ancient symbols. Before leaving, Liv gave Erling a small amulet, a braid of her own hair intertwined with protective herbs, sealed inside a piece of polished amber. She said as long as he carried it, she would know where he was, could feel if he was in danger. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was something, a tangible connection between them, even when separated. Erling and Ragna traveled half a day before encountering the hunters. There were 12 in total. Bjorn led the group as Erling had predicted, accompanied by Knut the fervent Christian, and 10 other warriors Erling had known since childhood. They saw each other across a clearing, both groups stopping, assessing, preparing for confrontation or negotiation. It was Halvard who emerged from the forest behind the warriors, and the sight of his father made Erling's heart ache painfully. The Jarl had aged visibly in the months since Erling's flight, more gray hairs, deeper lines on his face, posture heavy with disappointment and anger. But his eyes, when they met Erling's, contained something beyond fury. There was pain there, and confusion, and deep questioning from a man whose son had rejected everything he represented. Erling stepped forward alone, leaving Ragna behind as a show of good faith. He spoke with a voice that carried across the clearing, addressing his father formally, but not without emotion. He said he understood why they had come, that he blamed none of them for hunting him as a fugitive or traitor. But he asked for a chance to explain, to make them understand why he had chosen as he had. Halvard answered with a voice rough from the journey's hardship and suppressed emotion. He asked what spell had been cast on his son, what witch had bewitched his mind to make him abandon family, honor, duty. Knut added his own venom, declaring loudly that it was obvious. A demonic creature had seduced and corrupted the youth, and the only salvation was to kill the witch and drag Erling back to be purified by priests. Erling felt anger rise in his throat but forced it down. He replied with a deliberate calm that there was no spell, no supernatural seduction. There were only 2 people finding unexpected connection, and both choosing to follow that connection despite the consequences. He explained that Liv had saved his life during that initial storm, cared for him, and in the process, he had seen the possibility of a different life, a life lived by his own choice rather than imposed obligation. He asked his father, when was the last time Halvard had done something simply because he desired it, not because it was expected of him? When was the last time any of them had lived instead of just fulfilling roles? The question hung in the cold air, uncomfortable in its penetration. Halvard remained silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low but carrying across the distance. He said, understanding didn't change facts. Erling had abandoned duty, broken a marriage agreement, shamed his family. There were consequences for such actions. And as for the Huldra, she was a threat to villages, to simple people who depended on their forests, not out of malice perhaps, but simply by existing. Human settlements and supernatural creatures could not coexist peacefully. History proved that repeatedly. It was Ragna who spoke then, her voice carrying an authority that made even Halvard pause. She said the Jarl spoke of history he didn't fully know, that there were communities, ancient, hidden, but real, where mortals and those beyond the mortal had lived side by side for generations. This valley was one such place. There was no conflict because there was mutual respect, understanding that the world was big enough for multiple ways of being. Knut spat on the ground and declared that was heresy, blasphemy against God. Ragna turned to him with white eyes that somehow seemed to see him perfectly, and said that gods, old or new, didn't care as much about theology as mortals like to believe. That she had walked in dreams with Odin, conversed with Christian spirits too, and all said the same fundamental truth. Genuine love was too rare and precious to be destroyed by fear and ignorance. The declaration created waves of discomfort among the hunters. Several made protective gestures. Others simply looked confused. Halvard raised a hand to silence murmurs, his eyes fixed on Erling. He asked his son directly, If he returned now, if he agreed to fulfill his duties, Halvard would consider forgiving the transgression. The marriage with Sigrid could be renegotiated eventually. The inheritance would remain intact. Erling just needed to abandon this madness and come home. Erling felt the weight of that offer, everything he had lost being offered back. Part of him, small but persistent, yearned to accept, to return to the simplicity of a life planned by others. But then, he touched the amulet Liv had given, felt the amber's warmth against his skin, and knew that part of him belonged to the past, to the man he had been before the storm, before discovering there was more in the world than empty honor. He replied to his father with respect, but absolute firmness. He said he could not return, that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He asked not for forgiveness because he didn't see his actions as a mistake. He asked only that Halvard let him follow the path he had chosen, live a life that brought true meaning. As for the Huldra hunt, if Halvard insisted on it, Erling would defend Liv with his own life. That wasn't a threat, just a fact. The silence that followed was heavy and charged. Halvard looked at his son for a time that seemed eternal, and Erling saw a battle happening behind his father's eyes. Anger fighting love, tradition fighting reluctant understanding. Finally, the Jarl spoke, his voice weary with the weight of an impossible decision. He said he could not bless that union, could not officially accept Erling's choice. Doing so would admit weakness, would encourage other youths to reject duties, but neither would he destroy his son in the name of abstract principles. He declared that Erling was dead, dead to Bjorgvin, dead to family, dead to name and inheritance. From that moment, Erling, son of Halvard, no longer existed. The man in the clearing was a stranger, with no connection to the Jarl or his lands. As for the Huldra hunt, Halvard declared the expedition had failed. The tracks ended in the mountains, the creature had fled beyond reach. They would report that upon returning, and no one would question the Jarl's word. The supernatural threat was eliminated by removal, not death. It was a convenient fiction that would satisfy all but the most fanatical. Knut protested immediately, saying Halvard was allowing an abomination to escape, that they were abandoning sacred duty. Halvard turned to him with a look that made the Christian recoil a step. He said Knut was welcome to continue the hunt alone if he wished, but Halvard and his men would return to Bjorgvin. Anyone who questioned the Jarl's judgment would find there were forms of hunting beyond the supernatural. The veiled threat was enough. Knut closed his mouth, though the hatred in his eyes promised this wasn't over. Not for him, but for now, he was defeated. Halvard looked at Erling one last time. For a brief moment, the Jarl's mask fell and Erling saw only his father, an aging man who had lost a wife years before and now lost a son too, not to honorable death, but to incomprehensible choice. Halvard spoke softly, words just for Erling. He said he hoped it was worth it, what Erling had chosen, that the price had been too high to be wasted. Erling replied equally softly that it was worth every moment, every sacrifice, that he was sorry for the pain he had caused, but could not live another person's life, even if that person was who his father wanted him to be. Halvard nodded once, a small, stiff gesture, then turned and walked back into the forest. His men followed, Bjorn casting one last inscrutable look at Erling before disappearing among the trees. Knut remained a moment longer, fixing Erling and Ragna with a gaze full of dark promises. He spoke softly, his voice charged with fanatical conviction. He said Erling had condemned his soul to perdition, that the witch would drag him to hell. But days would come, he swore, when Christianity would rule all northern lands. And then creatures like Huldris would be hunted to extinction, and those who protected them would be burned as heretics. Ragna replied calmly that she had already seen that future in visions, skies darkened by smoke from burning books, ancient forests falling under iron axes, old magic disappearing from the world. But she had also seen beyond that, to a time when the pendulum would swing back, when humanity would rediscover there was mystery in the world that no doctrine could completely explain. Knut could have his centuries of domination, but it wouldn't be eternal. Then she made a gesture with her hand, and Knut was pushed back as if by a sudden wind, though the air remained completely still. He stumbled, regained his balance, then ran after his companions, casting terrified glances over his shoulder. When silence finally returned to the clearing, Erling let himself fall to his knees, trembling with the release of accumulated tension. Ragna placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said he had done well, that he had honored both past and future with his words. Few men achieved that balance. They returned to the settlement as quiet heroes. The community had waited anxiously, prepared for evacuation or defense, but now celebrated the peaceful resolution. Liv ran to meet Erling before he even reached the village limits, throwing herself into his arms with force that nearly knocked him over. She cried and laughed simultaneously, checking him obsessively for injuries despite his assurances he was unharmed. That night, the community held a feast of celebration and gratitude to the gods, old and new, for allowing resolution without bloodshed. Mead flowed freely, roasted meat was shared generously, and the local skald sang ancient sagas of heroes who chose love over duty, sacrifice over safety. Some of those stories ended tragically, others triumphantly, but all recognized the courage necessary for such choice. Erling and Liv sat together near the central fire, fingers intertwined, watching the community that had welcomed them celebrate around them. Liv whispered she still couldn't quite believe it. That part of her expected to wake and find it all a cruel dream. Erling squeezed her hand and replied that if it was a dream, then they were dreaming together. And that was enough. Dark epilogue. The thread continues. The months that followed established a new rhythm of life. Erling adapted completely to the community, his leadership and combat skills making him a valuable member. He taught fighting techniques he had learned in Bjorgvin, improving the settlement's defenses. Liv deepened her magic studies with Ragna, learning forms of Seder her own mother had never taught. Together, they built their own house on the settlement's edge, not as isolated as Liv's old house, but offering adequate privacy. As seasons passed, they became integral threads in the community's fabric. Erling participated in leadership councils, his perspective as someone who had lived in both worlds, common mortal and world between worlds, offering valuable insights. Liv became a respected healer, her skills saving lives during a particularly brutal winter when illness swept the settlement. It was during that winter that Liv made a surprising discovery. Her body, unchanged for decades, began to change in subtle ways. Ragna, with her supernatural sight, noticed first and took leave for a private examination. After a long consultation involving herbs, enchantments, and ancient knowledge, Ragna pronounced something Liv had always believed impossible for her kind. She was pregnant. Children between Huldras and mortals were extremely rare. Her mother had told her it happened perhaps once a century, and only when the bond between partners was exceptionally deep and genuine. The child would be unique, carrying blood from both worlds in equal measure, not leaning more toward one side or the other. Such children often possess special gifts, but also faced unique challenges. When Liv told Erling, he reacted first with shock, then with overwhelming joy. He held her carefully, as if she might break, marveling at the impossible miracle. He whispered he didn't know he could love more than he already did, but apparently he was wrong. Liv cried against his chest, tears of happiness mixed with fear. Fear that such complete happiness couldn't last, that destiny would exact a price eventually. But days passed and happiness remained. Liv's belly grew slowly, more slowly than a normal human pregnancy, Ragna explained, because a child between worlds took its own time. The entire community prepared for the child's arrival, weaving blankets, carving toys, offering advice and support. The child was born the following spring, when wildflowers covered the valley and the air smelled of renewal. It was a long, difficult birth. Liv's body wasn't fully equipped for birthing a half-mortal child. Ragna and other healers worked through the night, using all the magic and skill they possessed to ensure mother and baby's safety. When dawn finally painted the sky gold and pink, a newborn's cry echoed through the settlement. It was a girl, small but healthy, with dark hair like her mother and eyes that promised to be blue-gray like her father's. But when Ragna examined her carefully, she found the mark of her mixed heritage, a small tail, thin and delicate, covered with soft fur. Not as pronounced as her mother's, but present, real, a mark that she was truly between worlds. Erling held his daughter for the first time with hands trembling with awe and terror. She was so small, so fragile, and yet represented everything he and Liv had risked, everything they had chosen. They named her Astrid in honor of the mother Erling had lost, but also because the name meant beautiful as a goddess, fitting for a child who carried both mortal and divine in her veins. The following years were the most peaceful Erling or Liv had ever known. Astrid grew strong and curious, demonstrating gifts from both parents, her mortal father's strength and courage, her mother's connection to the forest, and whispers of magic. She learned quickly, speaking not only the human tongue, but also the ancient languages Liv taught, those that allowed conversation with animals and spirits. But peace was always temporary in a world of boundaries between realms. When Astrid was 4 winters old, news came through distant travelers. Bjorgvin had fallen under new leadership, not her grandfather Halvard, who had died 2 winters before in his bed, but Knut, the fanatical Christian who had married the Jarl's widow and assumed control through political manipulation. And Knut had not forgotten his promise to eliminate supernatural threats from the northern lands. He was organizing a crusade, not a small hunting expedition, but a significant military force, supported by priests from the south and funded by forced conversions of neighboring Jarls. He planned to purify the eastern forests, destroy settlements of heretics and demons, bring the light of the one God through iron and fire. The news fell over the community like a cold shadow. Everyone knew they couldn't withstand an organized military force. Their strength was in concealment, not open combat. They needed to evacuate, move deeper into the forests, perhaps even beyond known borders to lands where Christianity had not yet penetrated. But Erling proposed an alternative. He had heard stories of lands across the seas to the west, green islands where the old ways were still honored, where mixed communities of mortals and others lived in relative peace. The journey would be dangerous, especially with a small child, but staying meant eventual destruction. After much debate, the community decided to split. Some would go deeper east, trusting the ancient forests for protection. Others, including Erling, Liv, and little Astrid, would attempt this sea journey west. It was risky, but offered the possibility of genuine new beginnings in lands beyond Knut's and his fanatics' reach. Preparations took months. They needed to reach the coast, find a ship willing to take them across treacherous seas, gather enough supplies for a journey that could take weeks. Ragna, now frail with advanced age, chose to stay. She said her visions showed her near death anyway, and she preferred to die protecting those who stayed rather than waste away in foreign land. The night before departure, Ragna called Erling and Liv for final counsel. She gave them protection amulets she had spent months preparing and shared a vision she had had. She saw Astrid growing strong and wise in the western lands, living a life that honored both aspects of her nature. She saw the lineage continuing through her, not just blood, but a legacy of choice, of courage to be true to oneself despite the world saying it was impossible. But she also saw the price. She said Erling, mortal as he was, would age long before Liv or Astrid. A time would come when he would be old, and they still young, when he would have to leave them for the final journey to Valhalla or whatever afterlife awaited him. That separation would be a pain they would both carry, but it was inevitable from the moment they chose to unite. Erling replied he had known that from the beginning, had accepted that truth when he chose Liv over the immortality of name and lineage. Decades of true love were worth centuries of empty existence. Liv held his hand firmly, agreeing through tears she didn't try to hide. The journey to the coast was arduous, but without serious incident. They found a merchant ship captain willing to take them, for a high price, paid with the last pieces of silver Erling had kept hidden since Bjorgvin. The captain asked few questions, though his eyes watched Liv with obvious curiosity and occasionally rested on Astrid with disturbing recognition. But he kept his words to himself and focused on navigation. The crossing was an ordeal of its own. Autumn seas were treacherous. Storms arose without warning, and more than once it seemed waves would swallow them completely. Astrid, terrified by the furious ocean, cried in Liv's arms while Erling held them both, praying to the old gods for protection. Liv sang ancient calming songs, and strangely the seas seemed to respond, calming slightly when her voice rose above the winds. After 3 weeks of a voyage that felt like 3 years, they finally sighted land. A green coast dotted with white cliffs, small villages smoking peacefully in the distance. The captain identified it as one of the outer islands, a remote settlement where questions were rare and strangers were judged by present actions, not hidden pasts. They disembarked with minimal possessions, but maximum hope. The locals watched them with curiosity, but without open hostility. When Erling explained they sought land to settle, a place to raise a family in peace, the village's old chief studied them at length, then nodded. There was land available on the forest's edge, he said, if they were willing to work hard and respect local customs. Erling and Liv built a new house, the third in their lives together, each representing a different phase of their journey. This one was solid, made to last, with an extra chamber for Astrid to grow in. They worked side by side, hands calloused from labor, but hearts light with finally achieved freedom. Years passed in relative tranquility. Astrid grew, becoming a young woman who perfectly balanced dual natures. She was strong and skilled with weapons like her father, but could also speak with forest spirits and heal with touch like her mother. The village learned to accept her, even value her, especially when her gifts proved useful. Erling aged as Ragna had predicted. His hair turned silver, his back curved slightly, his hands developed the tremor of age, but his eyes remained clear and bright when they rested on Liv, who seemed to have aged only a few years in the decades since they met. The disparity was an occasional source of sadness, moments when Erling saw his aging reflection and realized time would eventually separate them. But more often, it was just an accepted fact, part of the price they had agreed to pay. When Erling passed 50 winters, he began to feel a call he couldn't completely explain. He dreamed of Valhalla, of Valkyries riding, of halls where warriors feasted eternally. But he also dreamed of something different, green fields where mortals and immortals walked together, where separation didn't exist, where love transcended barriers of life and death. Ragna had once said that those who lived between worlds often created their own beyond, not limited by Valhalla or Helheim, but shaped by the life they had lived. Perhaps, Erling thought, there would be a place after death where he could wait for Liv and Astrid, where they would eventually reunite when their own long lives came to an end. It was in his bed, surrounded by Liv and Astrid, both holding his hands, that Erling finally left the mortal world. His last words were of gratitude for the storm that had lost him in the mountains, for Liv's house emerging from the snow, for the impossible choice he had made and never regretted. He whispered for Liv to continue, to live fully, and to teach Astrid to do the same. Then he closed his eyes, and breath ceased, a small, peaceful smile on his lips. Liv held Erling's body for a long hour after, crying silently while Astrid rested her head on her shoulder. The pain of loss was sharp as a knife, but beneath it was deep gratitude. They had had decades, precious decades neither of them expected when they met that stormy night. They had created life together, family, legacy. Erling was buried under the great oak he himself had planted years before, in a ceremony that honored both Norse traditions and the island's local customs. Liv sang ancient songs in tongues most didn't understand, but all felt their power and beauty. And when Earth was finally mounded over the grave, she placed a special amulet, a braid of her own hair intertwined with his, sealed in amber, to ensure that even in death, the connection between them would remain. Years passed. Astrid grew completely, eventually finding her own partner, a gentle man who accepted her dual nature without fear. She gave Liv grandchildren who carried still more diluted traits of Huldra heritage, but traits present nonetheless, perpetuating the lineage. Liv lived among her extended family for decades more, aging finally in ways Huldras normally didn't age. Ragna had predicted that too. The bond with a mortal had fundamentally changed Liv, made her more mortal herself. It wasn't a curse, but a transformation. A final gift Erling had given without realizing. When Liv finally felt her own end approaching, not from illness, but from simple completeness, a sensation of a cycle ending, she walked into the nearby forest. Astrid found her there at dawn, lying peacefully under ancient trees, a smile on her lips, hands crossed over her chest. And curiously, impossibly but real, beside her on the grass was the braided hair and amber Liv had buried with Erling decades before, as if placed there by invisible hands. Astrid buried her mother beside her father under the oak that had now grown massive and strong. She planted wildflowers over both graves, those her mother loved, those that grew in the forests where her parents' story had begun. And when wind blew through the oak's branches, Astrid swore she could hear voices. Two voices intertwined, laughing and whispering, finally reunited in a place beyond mortal and immortal worlds. The story of Erling and Liv became legend on the island, passed through generations. It wasn't a saga of battle glory or conquered treasures, but something rarer. A story of love that transcended barriers between worlds, of courageous choices made by the heart rather than honor, of lives lived authentically despite all obstacles. And when Astrid's descendants looked at the graves under the ancient oak, they felt something they couldn't completely explain. A sensation that love strong enough doesn't end with death, but transforms, continuing in ways mortals only glimpse through dreams and whispers of wind and leaves. The storm that had nearly killed Erling had ended up saving him, leading him to a home he didn't know he sought, to a woman he didn't know he needed, to a life he could never have imagined. And in the end, that storm and everything that followed proved to be not a curse, but the greatest blessing any god could have granted.